The static hissed across Winston's repurposed tablet screen like a swarm of agitated bees. The pig adjusted his spectacles, crafted from bent coat hangers, and narrowed his eyes at the scrolling hexadecimal code. Intelligence did not wander into Muddington Acres by accident. It was hunted, tracked, and distilled into actionable data. Winston tapped a hoof against the keyboard, isolating a fragmented packet buried within agricultural trade feeds. The decryption algorithm churned, spitting out coordinates pointing squarely toward London. A name resolved from the cipher, Sealer's Vein, a mid-level enforcer for a syndicate known as the Gilded Beak, but deeper metadata told an insidious story. Vein was merely the face of an agri-shell proxy acquisition firm, quietly purchasing land parcels around historic estates to launder illicit capital. The museum where Vein held court was less a cultural institution and more a front for money laundering through unprovenanced antiquities. Winston logged the coordinates, satisfied. Paranoia was merely unverified data. Cluck emerged from the perimeter hedgerow, feathers ruffled by damp mist, carrying the fried remains of the tracker module in his beak. He dropped the charred circuitry into Henrietta's awaiting basket with a soft clatter. The hen stepped forward, her gaze sharp and analytical. She had already cross-referenced Winston's intercepted data with the broader intelligence grid. The immediate tech threat was neutralized, but the board had shifted. They were no longer defending a Coop. They were navigating a geopolitical chessboard disguised as British agriculture. A shadow swept over the yard. A carrier pigeon, its leg banded with encrypted microfilm, descended with military precision. Cluck caught the bird mid-flight, untying the silver canister from its ankle. Inside lay the fresh mandate. The target was Vein. The location, a high-security auction at the Museum of Modern Art. The objective, eliminate the asset using approved theatrical methods. Cluck swallowed the message whole, his internal processor updating the mission parameters with cold efficiency. He adjusted his comb, mentally calculating sightlines, structural weak points, and escape vectors. Henrietta's voice crackled through his earpiece, outlining fallback contingencies for every possible failure mode. Cluck listened intently, his mind mapping the museum's architectural flaws against Vein's known security detail. Every professional knew that assassination was less about firepower and more about physics. Gravity, momentum, and poorly placed trusses were his true allies. Henrietta unfurled a tactical map drawn on the back of a poultry feed sack. She outlined the infiltration protocols, thermal dampening for the ventilation shafts, acoustic masking for security drones, and a fallback route through the museum's climate-controlled archives. Cluck nodded, absorbing the data. He was ready to deploy. But fate, much like Gerald, rarely adhered to schedules. The goat bounded into the yard, eyes wide with manic energy, and charged directly toward the backup wire conduit that Cluck had rigged to power his disguised generator. With a sound like snapping celery, Gerald's teeth sheared through the primary feed line. Sparks showered the grass as the temporary network collapsed. Cluck stared at the severed cables, then at Gerald's unrepentant grin. The planned transport route was dead in the water. He sighed internally, recalculating instantly. They would have to improvise. Cluck pointed sharply toward a passing refuse collection truck bound for the capital. It was loud, it smelled of decay, and it offered zero climate control. Perfect. Makeshift caravan required precise timing. Cluck coordinated with Henrietta over the comms, synchronizing his movements with the rhythmic thud of the truck's suspension. The journey was a blur of gravel, diesel fumes, and steady reassurances. By the time Cluck slipped through the service entrance of the Museum of Modern Art, he had shed his farm persona entirely. He moved through marble corridors like a shadow given feathers, blending into the crowd of tuxedoed donors and velvet-troped exhibits. The air was thick with the scent of old money and impending violence. Cluck scanned the grand hall, his head tilting as he locked onto Sealer's Vein across the room. The gangster stood beside a display of ancient pottery, unaware that his financial empire had just become collateral damage. Cluck adjusted his tie, tapped his wing against his flank, and prepared to arrange the scenery. The mission parameters were set. The board was moving. The London fog clung to the pavement like a damp wool coat. but Cluck Norris felt none of it. To the casual observer walking past the Museum of Modern Art, he was merely a highly detailed bronzework sculpture of a Gallic warrior, complete with a helmet and an air of stoic determination. In reality, he was standing on a velvet plinth in Gallery 4, his left leg perpetually raised in mid-stride, and his internal monologue was currently drafting the eulogy for Agri-Shell's local director. Position established, Cluck thought, his eyes scanning the marble floor with the precision of a laser-guided missile. The target moves through the east wing at 1400 hours. I have the high ground, or rather, the plinth height, now to assess the terrain. He shifted his weight imperceptibly. The bronze paint on his feathers itched, but discipline was the assassin's first weapon. 100 yards away, a cluster of carrier pigeons fluttered nervously near a decorative fountain. These were Henrietta's operatives, tasked with relaying real-time updates on guard rotations. But as Cluck watched, one pigeon abandoned its post entirely, dive-bombing toward a nearby cafe table where tourists had carelessly dropped a crust of sourdough. The other pigeons followed like flock-minded traitors, abandoning the mission for bakery scraps. Henrietta's remote support grid collapsed into culinary chaos. "Comms are down," Cluck noted dryly. "Henrietta is likely screaming into a void. Typical, he would have to rely on his own sensors." He tracked the target's route, past the impressionist wing, across the polished gallery floor, and toward a restricted service corridor. It was a straight line, but straight lines were for amateurs. Cluck's mind immediately began constructing a kill chain based on the principles of kinetic energy and structural failure. He remembered Gerald's chaotic chewing of wiring conduits back at Muddington Acres, combined with the runaway shopping trolley incident from 3 winters past. The math was elegant in its absurdity. A heavy-duty service elevator descended 2 corridors over, its steel doors grinding open. Cluck's eyes narrowed. If he could route a weighted counterbalance through that shaft, using the museum's own climate control vents as a launch platform, he could drop a 300-pound antique bust directly onto the target's path. But the mechanism required a trigger. A shopping trolley, modified with a severed cable and guided by a series of strategically placed marbles from the gift shop display, would provide the necessary momentum. The trolley would strike a lever, releasing the vent louvers, which would swing down like guillotine blades made of aluminium. It was convoluted. It was brilliant. It was entirely chicken-sized. "The plan is set," Cluck affirmed, maintaining his bronze stare. "Now to wait for the variables to align." A security guard paused near the plinth, squinting at Cluck. "Must be one of those new interactive exhibits," he muttered to his partner before wandering off toward the gift shop. A sudden clucking echoed from the courtyard outside the large stained glass windows. Cluck's head snapped toward the sound. Standing on the museum steps, pecking aggressively at a discarded kebab wrapper, was a rooster. But not just any rooster. His comb was dyed an unnatural shade of electric blue, and he wore a tiny leather aviator scarf despite the mild weather. He let out a series of sharp, mocking crow that sounded suspiciously like a parody of Cluck's own dramatic morning calls. The rival's presence added a variable to the equation. Foreign interference, Cluck realized, his feathers bristling beneath the paint. A rival operative, probably sent to disrupt my positioning or signal the target. The blue-crested rooster began strutting toward the service entrance, clearly intending to challenge Cluck's territory or draw security attention. Cluck calculated the probability of detection, 94% if he engaged directly. He would have to adjust the trap. If the rival moved into the gallery, his own elaborate sequence could be compromised. Note the vector, Cluck thought, mentally updating his dossier. The aviator rooster is now an active threat. I will use him as an unwitting accelerant in the shopping trolley trajectory. He shifted his gaze back to the corridor entrance. The target would arrive any moment. The pigeons were still eating sourdough. Henrietta was undoubtedly furious, but Cluck Norris did not panic. He merely stood statue, still, waiting for the scenery to fall into place. Cluck stood motionless within a papier-mâché shell, feathers tucked tight against his ribs, waiting for the geometry to align. The gallery hummed with oblivious tourists. To observers, he was merely part of the exhibit. In truth, he calculated velocity vectors and the precise moment the angry shell-linked gangster would step into the kill zone. Below the velvet rope sat the executioner, a heavy shopping trolley loaded with lead weights disguised as abstract sculptures. It rested on a polished marble ramp angled toward the central walkway. Above it hung stage rigging, a massive suspended plinth designed to drop directly onto the gangster's path once the trolley herded him into position. Cluck's role was simple: trip the tension wire with his beak, guide the impact, and vanish. He adjusted his stance, feeling the strain in his claws against the fake metal plating. Henrietta's signal should have arrived by now. The carrier pigeon network was supposed to provide real-time tactical updates. Instead, the comms were awash of static and frantic cooing. Museum automated feeders had attracted a flock of urban birds, turning the reliable aerial relay into a chaotic dinner bell. Cluck squinted through the statue's eye slits. He could not afford to wait for the birds to finish their meal. Timing was everything. He made the call. With a precise flick of his beak, Cluck nudged the tension wire release lever hidden beneath the base. The mechanism clicked. The trap sequence engaged. The shopping trolley lurched forward, wheels catching the marble slope with a low rumble. Lead weights shifted inside the basket, centering the load for maximum kinetic transfer. Cluck held his breath, ready to trigger the secondary release on the rigging cables. Then came an iridescent flash. Perched precariously on the edge of the suspended plinth directly above him was a foreign rooster. He wore peacock blue feathers and an elaborate comb, radiating aggressive territoriality. Cluck froze. The intruder locked eyes with him through the statue's cracked paint, let out a sharp crow, and launched himself downward. The impact against Cluck's back was sudden. The foreign rooster pecked furiously at the bronze plating, wings flapping to maintain balance while driving Cluck forward. The struggle threw off his center of gravity. His claws scraped uselessly against the base as he tried to stabilize himself for the rigging trigger. The tension wire slipped from its catch prematurely. The trap detonated early. The shopping trolley did not roll down the ramp. It launched. It careened across the marble floor with terrifying speed, bypassing the calculated kill zone entirely. Cluck fought against the foreign rooster's relentless pecking, but avian duels demanded immediate engagement. He could not spare a wing to adjust the rigging drop. Below, the gangster stepped into the gallery, checking his watch. The trolley roared toward him. With a reflex born of street survival, he scrambled sideways, slipping on a polished floor spot and tumbling into a dense cluster of sightseers. The trolley sailed harmlessly over his head, crashing violently into a display of fragile avant-garde vases. Glass shattered in a spectacular cascade as the basket screeched to a halt against a pillar. The rigging cables groaned but held, leaving the plinth dangling uselessly overhead. Cluck stood his ground, pinned beneath the foreign rooster's weight. Through the static-filled comms, he caught fragments of Henrietta's voice, drowned out by the frantic cooing of the feeder-distracted pigeons. She was warning him about frequency anomalies. Cluck tilted his head. The foreign rooster wasn't just a territorial nuisance. His wing flaps were generating localized electromagnetic pulses, disrupting Henrietta's signal and throwing off the museum sensors. This was no chance encounter. The rival was manipulating the interference deliberately. Cluck hopped free of the shell, feathers ruffled but posture unbroken. He assessed the scene, the gangster safe among the crowd, the trap compromised, the gallery descending into orderly confusion. The infiltration was a failure. He let out a soft, professional cluck, turned his back on the shattered vases, and melted toward the service corridors. The mission required reconfiguration. Cluck maintained the stoic posture of a bronze rooster, though his internal monologue screeched like a malfunctioning alarm. The primary trap lay in ruins, its delicate tension wires snapped by the interloper's ill-timed strut. Worse, the heavy thud of security boots vibrated through the marble floor, converging on the exhibit hall. Two guards rounded the corner, their eyes scanning the displays with professional suspicion. Cluck froze. Detection meant the collapse of the entire operation and a likely return to Muddington Acres without his dignity intact. "Check that plinth," one guard barked, pointing a flashlight beam directly at Cluck's painted-on eye. The light flared, blinding and invasive. Cluck's claws twitched against the pedestal, threatening to break cover. He calculated escape vectors, 0 viable options in the open. The only advantage lay in unpredictability, and currently his reputation for predictability had been ruined by that fool of a rival. The foreign rooster, still feigning indignation from the gallery floor, strutted toward a maintenance hatch near the ventilation ducts. In a fit of pecking rage, he struck a rusted lever protruding from the wall. Metal groaned. A secondary mechanism, long dormant and designed for theatrical displays, shuddered into life. A hidden panel in the ceiling hissed open, releasing a cloud of prop smoke and the clatter of weighted sandbags onto the floor below. Chaos erupted. The sandbags created a cacophony that masked the guard's approach, while the smoke obscured vision. High above, the target, a gangster named Vinny the Vice, Morty flinched and stumbled backward, away from the security sweep. Cluck seized the opportunity. He shed his static pose, flapping silently to the edge of the plinth. The sandbags had knocked loose a heavy velvet rope barrier, which now dangled precariously over a display case filled with molten museum wax. Through the swirling smoke, Cluck focused on the far window where the Coop perched. A rhythmic tapping echoed against the glass. Tap, tap, pause, tap. Henrietta. Her shadow cast a sharp silhouette against the moonlight, forming dots and dashes with practiced precision. Contingency Alpha aligned. Proceed. The message was brief but reassuring. The tapping was rhythmic, precise, cutting through the din of collapsing set pieces. Cluck felt a familiar warmth in his gizzard. She was reading his body language from miles away, her mind synchronized with his tactical cadence. Cluck scanned the environment. The target was now retreating toward the service corridor, unaware of the kill zone forming in his wake. Cluck needed momentum. He spotted the runaway shopping trolley from the museum cafe, wedged behind a potted fern. With a precise kick of his spurs, he dislodged it. The trolley wobbled violently, its wheels singing a high-pitched shriek against the polished stone. Cluck gripped the handle with talon and beak, balancing on the rolling metal as he calculated the trajectory. 1 degree of error would send him into the guards, another would miss the fulcrum entirely. With a burst of feathery power, he launched onto the trolley's handle, riding it like a chaotic steed. He aimed not at the wax, but at the ventilation shaft grill just beyond it. The impact was calculated. The trolley smashed into the grill with bone-jarring force, the grill tearing free and falling backward to jam the mechanism of a nearby hydraulic lift. Cluck bounced clear, rolling behind a display of ancient pottery. The collision triggered the museum's fire suppression system. Sprinklers erupted, drenching the hall in water that pooled rapidly toward the floor drains. Vinny Morty, slipping on the wet marble, stumbled into the service corridor. Unbeknownst to him, the jammed hydraulic lift had shifted the alignment of a heavy stage truss above the corridor exit. The weight distribution was critical. One more movement would shift the fulcrum. Cluck pecked at a loose floor tile, exposing the control wire for the corridor's automatic doors. He severed it with his beak, locking the doors in the open position but reversing their magnetic seal. Vinny reached the end of the hall, fumbling for his coat. The reversed seal created a violent suction effect as the ventilation system roared to life, pulling air toward the shafts. Vinny was pulled forward by the draft, his feet leaving the floor for a heart-stopping moment before he grabbed a railing. The suction dragged him directly beneath the shifting truss. Cluck watched from the shadows, wings tucked, eyes narrowed. The trolley's impact had done its work. The truss groaned, tilting dangerously over Vinny's position. The gangster scrambled to release the railing, slipping again into the path of the falling sandbags now dislodged by the vibrations. The emergency plan unfurled with the quiet inevitability of a falling guillotine. Cluck remained pressed against the cold marble plinth, his internal monologue reciting tactical parameters while his external reality consisted of dust motes and distant museum footsteps. The foreign rooster's challenge had served its purpose admirably, drawing the security detail into a chaotic ballet of misplaced aggression. Now, the kill zone awaited its visitor. The gangster entered the gallery with the heavy tread of a man accustomed to breaking things. He spotted Cluck's disguised form and lunged, mistaking the wax replica for an actual threat. At that precise moment, Cluck triggered the secondary lever buried beneath his own plumage. The hydraulic release clicked. A museum display trolley, previously wax-slicked by a well-placed drop of polishing compound, began its slow, gravitational roll down the polished slope. It gained speed with cheerful indifference. The gangster pivoted to intercept the rolling metal box, only to slip on the very slickness intended for him. His flailing arms sent him tumbling backward into the open pigeon coop mounted on the wall. The impact was catastrophic in its absurdity. 1,000 feathers detonated outward like a storm cloud of downy white cotton. The trolley followed, wedging itself directly into the ventilation shaft intake. The resulting chain reaction was purely mechanical and profoundly inelegant. Coils sprang, gears ground to a halt, and a cascade of museum display mannequins toppled in a synchronized domino effect that left the gallery floor unrecognizable beneath a thick, silent layer of wax, feathers, and displaced dry ice. The gangster vanished somewhere within the wreckage, his fate sealed by an overcorrection of footing and an unfortunate collision with a heavy ventilation cover. No blood was spilled. Only the faint smell of polished stone and startled poultry lingered in the air. Cluck did not linger to admire the engineering. He pivoted on his talons and slipped toward the service duct, his movements precise and silent. Security guards burst into the gallery seconds later, only to find their target entangled in a tangle of museum exhibits and confused homing pigeons. The rival rooster, still pecking frantically at the wax displays, mistook them for rival scavengers and led them on a futile chase through the gift shop. Cluck navigated the narrow service duct with practiced ease, leaving the London Museum behind without so much as a lingering glance. Back at Muddington Acres, Henrietta waited by the old oak fence post. The municipal recycling bin had been deposited exactly where the tactical schedule dictated. She pecked open the lid and retrieved the dismantled trap components, her beady eyes tracking the polished wax residue and bent hydraulic tubing. With a satisfied tilt of her head, she confirmed the method had executed precisely as projected. A professional job, executed with unnecessary feather density but flawless structural integrity. In his sty, Winston adjusted his spectral goggles toward the small radio receiver tuned to local news frequencies. He monitored the museum feeds through a hacked agricultural satellite uplink, watching the live coverage of the gallery incident. The anchor's bewildered voice described a bizarre mechanical failure involving a display cart and an unauthorized avian nesting site. Winston logged the telemetry. Target neutralized. No graphic violence. No prolonged suffering. Only the clean, efficient silence of a properly executed trap. He noted the statistical improbability of the feather dispersion pattern and filed it under operational success. The conspiracy's reach had been checked, at least for now. Cluck found his way back to the perimeter road as dusk settled over London. The mission objective was complete. The target had been removed from the board through a sequence of events so improbable that only a professional could have orchestrated them so cleanly. He crossed the boundary line, leaving the metropolitan sprawl behind in favor of familiar dirt tracks and distant farmyard lights. The night air felt lighter. The conspiracy would continue to weave its threads across borders and shell companies, but tonight, the immediate threat had been neutralized with nothing more than a trolley, some wax, and perfect timing. Cluck adjusted his comb, tucked himself into the warmth of the coop, and closed his eyes. Tomorrow would bring new contracts, new coordinates, and new opportunities for elaborate misdirection. But for now, there was only the quiet satisfaction of a job done right, and the distant, reassuring cluck of a well-deserved rest. The bantam had flown true. The gravel of Muddington Acres crunched beneath Cluck's talons, a far cry from the polished marble floors he had just abandoned. Dust still clung to his crest feathers, mingling with the faint scent of museum wax and industrial lubricant. In his mind, the exfiltration was etched in cold, tactical perfection, a silent glide through service ducts, The calculated abandonment of a decay statue, the elegant chaos of a runaway trolley meeting its unfortunate mark. He simply shook off his crest and tapped a grain of wheat near the Coop door. Professionalism required detachment, but even assassins needed to stretch their wings. Henrietta was already waiting by the nesting boxes, her head tilted with that familiar pragmatic assessment. She did not ask about the wax or the ventilation shafts. She had heard the distant commotion over the London wiretap henhouse transmitter and knew better than to pry into operational specifics. Instead, she tapped a gravel path toward the old oak fence. Cluck followed, his internal monologue shifting from dramatic reconnaissance to quiet analysis. The foreign rooster's interference had been a variable he could not account for, a sudden shift in the tactical equation that threatened to unravel 3 days of meticulous planning. Henrietta ruffled her wings, indicating the patterns they had tracked through the carrier pigeon network: molt cycles, grain shipment anomalies, and the peculiar routing of encrypted messages all pointed inward. The mole was not an external rival or a competing syndicate. It lived within the roost. Cluck gave a single, measured nod. Their partnership no longer required whispered assurances or coded pecks. It had hardened into something tactical and reliable. Even Gerald's persistent chewing on their disguises could be factored into the next operational timeline, a chaotic but manageable variable rather than a catastrophic flaw. The pigsty offered a stark contrast to the museum's climate-controlled galleries. Winston lay in the mud, snorting rhythmically as he chewed on a discarded satellite dish component. His sty had become an unlikely intelligence hub, lined with scavenged radar parts and stolen agricultural brochures. When Cluck approached, Winston did not look up from his calculations. He merely tapped a hoof against a grease-stained map of London. International surveillance agencies had been present at the museum during the kill. Drones hovered on perimeter frequencies. Tactical teams watched from adjacent rooftops. The farm was never just a farm. It was a chessboard observed by eyes in Geneva, Langley, and Whitehall. Winston's paranoia was not a quirk of confinement. It was a confirmed reality. Cluck circled the map, his gaze dropping to a cluster of red ink marks labeling Agri-Shell proxy acquisitions. The gangster had been a pawn, but the foreign rooster had been a probe, a proxy sent by a higher threat operating within the roost itself. The mole was not merely leaking information. They were actively testing Cluck's operational boundaries, pushing him toward museum-grade complications to assess his loyalty and capability. The conspiracy was no longer confined to agricultural supply chains or shell companies. It had bled into the very organization that trained him. A sudden rustle in the eaves broke the silence. One of the carrier pigeons landed awkwardly on the fence rail, its wings still bearing the distracted, jittery energy of the museum feeders. Despite the compromised network, it dropped a wax-sealed capsule near Cluck's feet. The message was encrypted, layered with cryptographic markers that pointed toward the next phase of the conspiracy. A deeper link between Muddington Acres and global intelligence operations had just been confirmed. Cluck picked up the capsule with careful precision, his mind already mapping supply routes, secure drop points, and the necessary countermeasures against a traitor wearing familiar feathers. The mission was complete, but the war for the Coop had only begun. He tucked the message away, turned back toward the nesting boxes, and settled onto his perch as the sun climbed higher. Peaceful farm life resumed its steady rhythm, masking the quiet calculations of a professional who knew exactly what was coming next.